Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to The Defense Rests, the podcast where we analyze criminal trials from an actual practicing and litigating criminal defense attorney. I'm your host, Rachel-Diane. On today's podcast, we are going to be doing part one of one of the most infamous and still highly debated criminal trials to have ever hit the United States. Under the legal lens today, the People versus Casey Anthony, the most hated woman in America. So as the infamous story goes, on June 16 of 2008, Casey Anthony left her home with her daughter, Kaylee Anthony, for her to go to work. But about 31 days go by, and Cindy Anthony, Casey's mother, gets extremely worried because she hasn't talked to her granddaughter at all during this point in time. And every time that she had tried to speak to her granddaughter, her daughter, Casey, had always had an excuse. So on July 15 of 2008, Cindy Anthony called the police and she reported her granddaughter missing and that her granddaughter had been missing for about 31 days. The police questioned Casey Anthony at the time about what happened to her daughter, and she said that her nanny that she had had for a couple of years now, named Zanny Fernandez Gonzalez, that she kidnapped her daughter, Casey Anthony, about 31 days ago, and she has not seen Kaylee since. As you'll hear through testimony, an investigation was done where this was discredited, and then therefore Casey Anthony did get arrested. She got arrested for child neglect as well as obstructing justice and basically lying to the police and derailing an investigation. While she was in custody on December 11th of 2008, skeletal remains were found in woods that were near the Anthony home. These remains were in a trash bag as well as wrapped in a Winnie the Pooh blanket. On December 19th of 2008, it was announced that the skeletal remains did in fact belong to Kaylee Anthony. From here, the district attorney had a grand jury convened in order to hear evidence to try to charge Casey Anthony with first-degree murder. A grand jury is just impartial people that are called to a courthouse. I want to say secret location, but it's not that secret. But they are closed proceedings, so we're never going to know what happened in the grand jury. All what we know is that a bunch of officers came to testify, as well as George Anthony came to testify. Now, a grand jury is significantly different than a trial, and it's also significantly different than a preliminary hearing, because a grand jury is pretty much just there to decide if the district attorney presented enough evidence to charge the defendant or the alleged defendant with the crime that the district attorney wants to charge. There's not going to be a defense attorney there. Defense attorney is not going to be putting on a case or cross-examining the district attorney's witnesses, such as they would be able to do in a preliminary hearing. It's only going to be the DA and their witnesses. But the unique thing about a grand jury is that they're actually able to ask questions. By the time the district attorney was done presenting their evidence to the grand jury decided to indict Casey Anthony for first-degree murder as well as aggravated manslaughter of a child under Florida law. So first-degree murder, as we all know, is the premeditation and deliberation killing of another human being. And premeditation and deliberation, even if you only thought about it and pondered upon it for a brief moment, that still counts for first-degree murder. And then aggravated manslaughter of a child under Florida law is stated that this is committed when a caregiver causes the death of a child as a result of willful, which is intentional, or culpable, which is sufficiently responsible, negligence. So that charge in particular has three different elements that need to be met. So first, it defines caregiver, which is a parent, a guardian, or somebody that has been specifically put in charge of that child's well-being in that moment. The second is culpable negligence. And this is basically saying that it's showing disregard for human life or safety. And then finally, the district attorney would have to prove that the negligence occurred in the ordinary actions of what a caregiver should have been giving in order to keep that child physically and mentally safe. So 3 years later, On May 24th of 2011, the trial begins. And this trial was extremely difficult in order to conduct because you have the right to a fair trial, which means you also have the right to a fair and impartial jury. But that's extremely hard to happen when a case is as big as this one was. I mean, this case was massive. It had already circulated the entire United States. So what ended up happening was that the defense attorney made a motion to move the trial outside of Orange County, Florida, and tried to move it into a different location, Florida, where maybe not as many people had heard about this case. The judge denied moving the trial. He decided to keep it in Orange County, Florida. But what he did was he flew in jurors from Orlando, Florida, and they were sequestered in Orange County, Florida for the remainder of the trial. Now, this was extremely difficult in order to get a jury on top of that, because when you're sequestered, it means that you can't go home. You don't have a cell phone, you don't have a computer, you don't have access really to the outside world. It's almost like you're in jail again, but in a hotel room. And if you have access to speak to your family, which you are given like that right to, there's gonna be a deputy or somebody with you to make sure that you're not discussing the case. And they're only gonna give you certain visitations for your family to come, and it's also going to be supervised. So these people are not allowed to work for 4 months. They're not allowed to be around their family. It's an extremely difficult process to be sequestered. So the district attorney came out really strong in opening statements. And as we know, opening statements, it's not an argument. It's basically just you telling the jury what you believe the evidence is going to show. And the district attorney told the jury members that the evidence is going to show first-degree murder, that when you take all of Casey's lies, and they gave an overview of the lies that they believed were going to be shown, and when you go over these insanely elaborate lies that she has been telling people for the past 31 days, coupled with her actions over those past 31 days, as well as Casey trying to abandon her car and the smell of the odor of decomposition within her car, there was no other conclusion that you can make besides first-degree murder. But throughout this, they needed to have a motive. And again, there's nowhere in the courtroom, or in this case, the Florida jury instructions, that says that a district attorney has to prove motive. But when you're trying to prove first-degree murder and you're trying to prove premeditation and deliberation, you typically need to say why. Why did this person plan out this murder? Why wasn't it an accident? Why wasn't it manslaughter? Things of that. Why wasn't it heat of the passion, right? So the motive that the district attorney gave for this case was that Casey wanted a child-free life, and that she wanted to live the life of somebody that was in their early 20s, as she was, but she wasn't able to because she had a daughter. They talked about how the evidence was going to show that Casey didn't even want to keep Kaylee, that she was hiding her pregnancy from her parents because she wasn't sure if she wanted to keep the child, and that she had confided in a friend that she was actually planning on giving Kaylee up for adoption when Kaylee was born. And one of the most memorable parts of the argument on behalf of the district attorney for this case was they went day by day through the 31 days that Kaylee was missing. And each one of those days, they put up a picture of Casey Anthony shopping, eating, partying, doing hot body contests, and other things that she had been doing, where you would think this was a normal, happy woman and not a woman that is in fear of her child being kidnapped. Okay, now we get to the defense's opening statements, and the defense has an extremely hard job here. And the reason why is because they have to overcome all of Casey's lies, which was an exorbitant amount of lies. And they also have to be able to explain, how could this woman have not had any communication with her daughter? How could her daughter have been missing for 31 days and she never called the police? And the defense claimed the reason why she never called the police to report her daughter missing was because Kaylee was actually never missing. They painted the story that on June 16th of 2008, Casey was taking a nap and she was sleeping, and when she woke up and came outside, that George, her father, had Kaylee's dead body in her hands, and that Kaylee had drowned in the pool that was in the backyard. They then say George begins yelling at Casey, saying, "How could you be so stupid? This is terrible. Your mother is never going to forgive you, and you're going to go away to jail for the rest of your life for child neglect." The defense then goes on in their opening statements and says that from there, George tells Casey to not worry about anything and that he is going to take care of the situation, and that it was actually George Anthony that disposed of Kaylee's body. Now Jose Baez needs to get over the hurdle of explaining away all of Casey Anthony's lies that she had been telling for the past 31 days. And Jose Baez comes out and says that ever since she was 8 years old, Casey had been sexually assaulted by her dad. She had been sexually abused for her entire childhood and teenage years. And because of that, she was taught to lie by her father. And she was taught to picture to the rest of the world this all-American family. But behind closed doors, it was really a house of terror. Jose Baez probably said in one of his most infamous lines in his opening statement, he said, "Casey was raised to lie, and it all began when Casey was 8 years old and her father came into her room and began to touch her inappropriately. She could be 13 years old and have her father's penis in her mouth and then go to school and play with the kids as nothing ever happened." So after opening statements are done, the district attorney gets up and they get ready to put on their case. And the district attorney always has to put on a case and evidence. And they always go first before the defense puts on their case in chief if they decide to. And that's because, as we know, the district attorney has the burden to prove all of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt. So the state's first witness was George Anthony, and right away the district attorney is going in hard in order to dispel the allegations that the defense put forward that George Anthony was a sexual assailant, a pedophile, and was raping his daughter. He gets up there and he denies all allegations of ever assaulting Casey. And then when he was asked if he was home when Kaylee died and her body was found, he said no. And that when he heard that for the very first time today from Jose Baez, it really hurt him. And in order to kind of put some grit behind George's testimony, the district attorney used evidence through George. They used George to lay the foundation for the evidence that they were bringing in, was these video recordings between Casey and her father, George, while Casey was in jail. So if you're ever in jail, if you're ever in prison, if you're ever in custody, just know that everything you talk about over the phone or when you are sitting there having a visitor, speaking over that phone, it's all recorded. In fact, they tell you this. They say that it's recorded and anything you say can and will be used against you, and they mean it. Full-heartedly, they mean it. So listen, if you're ever in custody, which I hope you're not, listen to that stupid recording. But Casey didn't say anything incriminating, but the reason why the district attorneys thought this was such good evidence to use, and they brought it in through George while he was testifying, because he laid the foundation for it so it could be published to the jury, is because of their conversations and the things that they were saying to each other. So there's this one particular conversation where Casey's crying and she just says, "I want you to know I love you so much. Out of everybody, I just wanted to reconnect with you. I felt like we have been distant lately." And she was saying, "I just want you to know that you were the best father and the best grandfather in the world that anybody could ask for, and I don't want you to ever think differently." There was also video that was shown of Casey kind of getting frustrated with her mom and telling her mom, "This is why I didn't want you to be here, and I only wanted dad to come visit me because dad wouldn't ask me a million questions, and I only wanted to see dad." Right? So it was trying to show that they had this bond, that she loved her father, and that somebody who was sexually assaulted wouldn't love their father to this extent and wouldn't be this kind to their father and saying that he's so great and he's the best man in the world. Now, I am not a psychologist, but I do want to say for the record that this was happening in 2008. And as we do know, through advancements in doctors, that there are certain syndromes or certain behaviors that victims of sexual assault do exhibit, even towards having kind actions or loving actions towards their sexual assailant. Now, I'm not saying I believe either one, I wasn't there. They're the only people that know. But I do just want to state that for the record, that if you are listening to this, this was the theories and the evidence that was being argued in a time that did not have a lot of information on sexual assault, and also did not view it as something that was that serious or that women told the truth. And when George was denying that he was ever there when Casey's lifeless body was found, he was saying that the last time that he ever saw Kaylee was at 12:50 p.m. on June 16th of 2008. And when he saw her, it was when Casey was getting ready to leave to work at Universal Studios, and she took her daughter Kaylee with her. And after they drove off and they left, he did not see her again. George continued his testimony and said that after Casey left on June 16th, she did not come home for 31 days. He says that on July 15th of 2008, he received a phone call from a car impound lot saying that they had Casey's car impounded and that it had actually been there for quite some time now. It had been there for a couple of weeks now. They sent this letter, but nobody came to pick up the car. So they're calling and saying, hey, you need to come get this car. He says that the reason why he was called and Casey wasn't called to come get her car was because he was the registered owner of the vehicle. So he went to go pick up the car, and when he did pick up the car, he says that there was a terrible stench that came from the car, that was being emitted from the car, and that it was the smell of a dead body, and that he knows it was the smell of a dead body because he was a police officer, a detective, for his entire life, pretty much his entire career, and so he knows this smell very well. So now that George is done testifying for the first time, he gets called throughout the trial. I think he gets called to the stand 4 or 5 times to testify. But now that he's done testifying for the first time for the state, the defense now gets up to cross-examine him. And the defense doesn't ask anything about sexual assault, which was a pretty big shocker since that was most of their opening statement. Instead, what the defense goes for is they bring up George's suicide attempt, and they have him read this suicide note where he was like apologizing to Kaylee and saying how much he let her down and how he wishes that he could have done things differently and could have helped her more, things of that nature, and that he just needed to die because he wanted to go be with his granddaughter Kaylee. So the defense wanted to bring in this suicide note because from their perspective, they're trying to argue, or at least insinuate, that the reason why George Anthony was trying to commit suicide and the reason why Kaylee was all over this note saying how he didn't do enough to protect her and he's so sorry is because he knows that it was an accident. He was there when he grabbed her body out of the pool, and then he ended up burying her remains. And that he just felt so guilty about this that he wanted to end his own life. The defense then goes in on George Anthony in regards to the stench that he found in the car. They try to discredit him by showing that he's made prior statements saying that this wasn't the stench of a dead, decomposing body, that in fact it was the stench of garbage, and that he had found garbage in the back of the car. He had found pizza previously. They also bring up, if you're so sure through all of your police experience that this was the smell of a dead body, then why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you follow protocol? Protocol. You were a retired detective, a retired police officer. You smelled a dead body. You knew this would have been a crime scene. So why didn't you do anything about it? George said because in that moment, he was not a detective. He was a scared father and a scared grandfather. What was interesting about this initial questioning of George actually comes from the defense. The defense was able to get phone records from Casey Anthony, and the phone records proved that on June 16th of 2008, the day that Kaylee died, phone records proved that Casey actually never left the home. Her cell phone was pinging on towers around the Casey Anthony home, the Anthony home, the entire day. But the defense never brought this up to discredit George Anthony anymore. I'm unsure why. I don't know if there was other things in these records that maybe they thought, okay, if I bring this up, it's opening up the door, and this other information is going to hurt us more than this information is going to help us. That's just what I would think if I wasn't going to bring in information that I thought was really strong towards my argument. So next, the prosecution calls multiple people to the stand. I'm going to kind of group them all together because they all pretty much testified about the same thing. There was Cameron Kapana, Nathan Look, I am terrible at pronouncing names. I just want to start with that. Nathan Lewinskas and Roy Clint to the stand. So all these people testified that they were the roommates of Tony Lazzaro and that Tony Lazzaro was the boyfriend of Casey Anthony at the time. They testified that Casey Anthony pretty much stayed at the house of Tony for those entire 31 days. And that she had began consistently staying over there starting in the middle of June. They said prior to June 16th, that early in June and the month before, Casey would come over several times a week and stay the night with her boyfriend, but that she would frequently bring Kaylee with her, her daughter, and that when she did bring her, she would bring toys and books and flashcards and movies and other things to entertain Kaylee, and that it wasn't abnormal for Kaylee to be over at the apartment complex with Casey. The roommates testified that although Casey would spend the night with Tony a couple of nights a week and she would bring Kaylee with her, she never actually allowed Kaylee to spend the night. That she would always drop Kaylee off either at the nanny's house, at her parents' house, wherever she would drop her off, but that Kaylee never spent the night. All of these people testified that after the mid of June 16th, they never saw Kaylee again. They also testified that they were under the belief that Casey was an event planner for Universal Studios, and that in the mornings of the days that she would sleep over, when she would wake up in the morning, that she would get dressed and she would be like in a full uniform, and that she even had a Universal ID badge that she would put around her neck like in a lanyard. On cross-examination, what the defense really honed in on for all of these people was the fact that they would all testify that Casey was the best mom ever, that she loved her daughter and her daughter very much loved her, and you could tell that, and that Casey was very attentive, she was very patient, she very much cared about the well-being of her daughter and things of that nature, and that Casey would always bring Kaylee as much as she could and try to give her these fun experiences. They said that they never saw Casey beat her, they never saw her really reprimand her with physical force, that she never lost her patience, she never abused her, and that it was very obvious that Kaylee loved her mom a lot. They also used this time in cross-examination to ask them if Casey ever talked about Kaylee missing, or if she ever talked about murder, about wanting to kill her child, or if she ever confessed to murder, and they said no. That she never brought up Kaylee missing, she never brought up murder, she never brought up things of that nature. Next, the prosecution called Maria Kish to the stand. She was one of the roommate's girlfriends at the time. She was pretty much asked the same questions that the prosecution was asking all these other roommates was, when did you see Kaylee last? Did you see her at any point after that? All of these just kind of basic questions where she was saying, no, I saw Kaylee in the beginning of June and I never saw her again after the middle of June. Then the prosecution asked a really weird question, and I don't know why. They asked her if she had ever been in Casey's car, and she said yeah, that she had been in the car, that they all had been in the car, that Casey would drive them around from time to time. I don't know where they were going with that question, but it opened the door for the defense. So on cross-examination, it was pretty short, pretty simple, because this woman didn't really know Casey that well, and she admitted that she was only around a few times during this time period. But when he asked her if the car smelled strange or if there was an odor coming from the car, she said no. When he asked her if anyone went, wow, this car like really stinks, what's wrong? She said no, like there was no abnormal odor coming from Casey's car during this time period. The prosecution then called a man named Brian Berner to the stand, and Brian Berner testified that he was the neighbor of the Anthonys, and that on June 18th, 2 days after we know that Casey had quote unquote gone missing, that Casey had come home and that she had backed her car up into the garage with the trunk facing the garage. She then came over and she asked to borrow a shovel, and she said that she needed the shovel for something to do with the bamboo plants that they had planted in their backyard. He testified that after an hour, she returned the shovel to him. Next, the prosecution called Tony Lazzaro to the stand. So he testified that he was Casey's boyfriend, that he had been dating her for a few months at that point in time, and that on the night of June 16th, which we all know is the day that Kaylee died or quote unquote went missing in this theoretical story at the time, was that Casey actually came over to his house that evening and they went out to Blockbuster and they rented a couple of movies. And that Casey seemed fine, that she seemed happy. In fact, he said, when he was asked about her demeanor, he said the same as she was every day, happy to see me, having a grand old time. He's saying that nothing seemed off. In fact, they rented a couple of Blockbuster movies to watch that evening, and footage or surveillance of that Blockbuster event was played, where you can see Casey just wrapping her arms around him, walking out of the store. It really wasn't like a heavy hitting videos of surveillance that they played, but it was basically just showing like she doesn't seem sad. When he was asked if Casey cried at all that night or if she seemed scared or nervous for any reason, he said no. He said nothing seemed different that night from any other night that they've hung out. Tony continued his testimony by saying starting that night, the 16th going forward, Casey pretty much always stayed there. That she slept there, woke up there, and she never really left. He testified how he was a DJ at the time at this club called Club Fusion, and he would DJ there every night, and that Casey would actually go with him. He testified that on top of Casey going with him almost every weekend to Club Fusion to help him promote the club, I guess, that she also participated in Club Fusion's Hot Body Contest on the following Friday, which was June 27th. Through Tony, the prosecution introduced a bunch of photos that was the heavy-hitting photos that kind of went viral all over the world, or at least the United States, right? And these pictures were of Casey Anthony in that small blue dress during the Hot Body Contest, pictures of Casey dancing with other people, dancing with other women, dancing on top of elevated surfaces, which is very common in clubs, by the way, smiling, kissing, and just having like a typical good time that you would have in a nightclub in your early 20s. And they made sure to point out that all of the dates for these pictures of Casey like partying and having a good time at Club Fusion, it all came after June 16th, which is the date that Kaylee quote unquote went missing. On cross-examination, Tony testified pretty much how he thought Casey was a great mom. Everyone had the same thing to say, everybody, that Casey was a great mom and that she really loved her daughter. And that was a point that Jose Baez really wanted to ingrain into the jury's mind, that all of these people have nothing but great things to say about Casey as a parent. And Tony then continues testifying that during this time period, and even before this time period, Casey never went out and bought knives. She never went out and bought a gun. She never went out and bought any sort of deadly weapons. Tony then continues his testimony by saying that actually on June 2nd, which was a couple of weeks before Kaylee, went missing, she died, she was killed. Whatever theory you want to go under, that on June 2nd, that the three of them, him, Casey, and Kaylee, all went to a community pool. And that Casey actually had to reprimand Kaylee because she had gotten too close to the pool and that she was trying to get in and swim by herself without her floaties or other life-saving preventative measures for toddlers in pools. He testified that it really seemed as if Kaylee loved to swim, that she loved pools, that was the main thing that Casey would want to take Kaylee to go do because she loved it so much. Mr. Lazzaro then testifies that on July 15th to 16th, Cindy Anthony, Casey's mom, actually showed up to his home. And that this was the first time that he had found out that anything was missing or anything, and that this was the first time he found out that anything was wrong and that Kaylee had been missing or that nobody knew where Kaylee was, because he was testifying that during this time period, he believed that Kaylee was either at her grandparents or with Zanny the nanny that she had been going to for years. He always thought Kaylee was being watched, even though he never saw her. So now this testimony is coming in on redirect. So after the district attorney goes first for their witness. The defense attorney has the right to cross-examine, and then the district attorney has the right to redirect, and then you can recross, and it could go on forever. But the district attorney is now doing redirect on Tony Lazzaro. And he says that after July 15th and 16th, when Cindy Anthony came to come get her daughter, he never saw Casey again, but that they did text for a couple of days afterwards. And the district attorney introduced these text messages into evidence, and they had Tony read these text messages out loud. And the text messages go as follow. It's dated from July 16th, and the subject line is, "I'm so sorry for not telling you." Casey says, "We need to talk. I love you more than you know." Tony responds with, where is Kaylee? She says, "I don't know." He goes, "Are you serious?" She goes, "I've been filling reports all night and taking them to apartments that I had taken Kaylee to. I'm the worst fucking person in the entire world. I don't know what I'll do if something happens to her." Tony asks, "How long has she been missing?" Casey goes, "Too long. Let's just leave it at that." He asks, "Why would you lie to me, saying that she is fine with the nanny? I'm the boyfriend who loves you and cares for your daughter." Casey goes, "How would it look that I'm the mother who would allow her daughter with some psycho?" Tony says, "I will do anything to help find Kaylee." Casey says, "I'm the dumbest person and I'm the worst mother. I honestly hate myself. I will never be able to forgive myself, nor will my family." Tony asks, "Who is this Zanny nanny person?" She says, "Someone I met through a mutual friend 4 years ago. She used to be my buddy's nanny before she became mine." Then on July 16th at 7:09 p.m., Casey texted him again and he goes, "I'm scared." Tony asks, "Are you home?" She says, "Yeah, finally getting a shower felt like hell." Tony asks, "Where did you drop off Kaylee the last time you saw her?" Casey responds with, "The bottom of stairs, Sawgrass Apartments. Told them and drove out with them, just back from Second Drive. If they don't find her, guess who gets blamed and ends up spending an eternity in jail?" Tony goes, "Why didn't you tell someone sooner? Why are you texting me and not calling?" Casey says, "I was scared to admit it, scared something was going to happen to my baby." Then there was a phone call on July 16th. Then there was more text messages where he asks her, "Where is Kaylee?" And she responds with, "I don't know." He says, "How do you not know?" And she says, "I don't know." Then on cross-examination, the defense attorney just kind of hones in on Tony testifying how great of a mom Casey was, and how much it was obvious that Kaylee loved her mother and always wanted to be around her. The prosecution then called a tattoo artist to the stand who said that after Kaylee had gone missing, after June 16th, Casey had come into his shop to get a tattoo, the tattoo that we all know, like Bella Vita, which means beautiful life. She got it tattooed on the back of her shoulder blade, and that she had received this tattoo in July. And as we know, Kaylee went missing, died, murdered after June 16th. Next, the prosecution called to the stand an employee of a place by the name of Amscott. And she testified that when she showed up to work, she noticed that there was a car that was parked next to the dumpsters and it appeared to be abandoned. She looked around the car, she didn't see any notes for the car saying like, "Hey, I ran out of gas, got a flat tire, we'll be back soon." Nothing. She came back the second day and the car was still there. She came back a third day and the car was still there. She told her manager and her manager said, "Okay, it's been 3 days, no one has come to claim this car. You need to call a tow company." And that is where our next witness comes into play. His name is Simon Birch. He was called to the stand next. He's the operation manager of a towing company by the name of Johnson's Towing. And he received a phone call on June 30th from Amscott asking to come by and tow a car that was in their parking lot that was next to the dumpster. He testified that there was a stench that was emanating from the car. And when they asked him to describe the stench, he said it smelled like decomposition of a human body. They asked him, "Well, how would you know what a dead body smells like that's decomposing?" And he said that through his work, that he used to work for a waste management company. And so he has been around trash and all different types of trash, dried trash, wet trash, all trash, because he worked for a waste management company. So he knows what trash looks like. He then said that he spent years working as a tow for law enforcement. and that there was several cars that he had to work with where the victim had died in the car and had been left there for a few days, or where somebody had committed suicide and nobody found them and the body had begun decomposing or completely decomposed in the vehicle. He says that once you smell that stench of a dead body, you'll never forget it, that it is a very noticeable stench. And it is very, very different from garbage and human waste. When he was asked when he noticed a stench in Casey's car, he said he actually didn't notice it at first. That when he did his cursory review of the car, which included looking in, looking under, looking around the car, he actually didn't notice any smell. It wasn't until he came up to the vehicle, like super close, and put his hand on one of the windows and put his head to like really peer in, that he noticed that the stench of a dead body was coming from the car. He then continued testifying that he was actually there when George Anthony came to pick up the car, that he was the person that helped out the Anthonys getting this car out of the lot. He said that he had walked with George up to the vehicle, he had opened the door, and that's when George got into the front passenger seat and tried to crank the car to start it, and that the car wouldn't start because it was actually out of gas. He then said that he thought it was weird because George went back to his vehicle to go pick up gas cans. And he said, oh, I have gas cans in my car that are filled. Let me just go grab it and I'll fill up this car and start it and keep it moving, right? Get it out of here. He said he thought it was weird, and he asked George, like, okay, you just conveniently have these filled gas cans in your car. And George replied with, oh yeah, like, I've done this before. I've done this a few times. And I've just noticed, like, in my experience that the cars are usually out of gas. So I need to have a couple of gas cans with me whenever I come pick up a car from the tow lot. After George came back and had his gas cans and was filling up Casey's car, the two of them, Simon and George, began walking around the car to try to find the stench of the smell. They had opened all the doors. They noticed that it was stronger in the back of the car. So then they opened the trunk, and that's when they realized, okay, this is where the smell is like emanating from. And he said that when they opened the trunk of the car, there was actually a bag of trash that was in there, and the bag of trash had pizza, other small food items, boxes, papers, things of that nature. So in cross-examination, Jose Baez pointed out how George actually took like a couple of weeks to come get the car. So Simon testified that they had sent out a letter to the Anthony home, because again, that's where the car was registered to. So they had sent out a letter saying, hey, your car is impounded. Can you please like come get it? And that nobody responded and nobody came to pick up the car. So they then called 2 weeks later and was like, yo, can you please come get this damn car? It's been sitting here forever. We don't want it. When he was asked if George told him why he took so long to get the car, Simon said no. He has no idea why it took George a couple of weeks to come pick up this vehicle. He did testify that he was only a couple of miles from the Anthony home, so that the mail system would not have taken 2 weeks for them to have gotten the letter, that it would have been there in a couple of days. He was then asked if he's so familiar with the smell of decomposition, of a body, of a dead body decomposing, why didn't he call the police? And he really did not have an answer for that. It was just like, I didn't really think of it. I just thought I smelled a dead body, that someone could have been dead in here, but I just didn't think of calling the police. He was then asked if the towing company ever alerted or told George or Cindy how long Casey's car was sitting at AMSAC before it got towed. And Simon said no, that they don't have that information. Nobody told them how long the car was sitting in the parking lot before it needed to get a tow. They never revealed that information to George or Cindy Anthony. It was never in the letter. It was never in the phone call. And then he was asked, okay, but do you know how long the car has been sitting there? And Simon said, yeah, the car had been sitting in the parking lot of AMSAC for 3 days. And so Jose Baez asked, okay, well, if nobody told you that information from AMSAC, If your company doesn't know that information, how do you know that it had been sitting there for 3 days? And he said, well, George told me that after we grabbed the gas cans, when we were walking back to the car to fill up Casey's car, that George told me that it had been sitting at AMSAC for 3 days and that they didn't tell him where it was towed from or how long it had been sitting there. By the way, I apologize. I've been saying AMSAC. It was AMSCOT. I think I've been intertwining the words, but the car was left at AMSCOT. I also do want to throw in a little preference because I think it's important. During this trial, the Anthonys, George and Cindy Anthony, were granted permission to sit in during the entire trial as the alive lineage of the victim. And this was really shocking, and it's not usually done because witnesses are usually not allowed to sit in a courthouse, like in the courtroom when a trial is happening. And that's because we want to preserve the testimony of people. Because if you're sitting in a courtroom and you're listening to testimony, it's going to taint yours. If you notice that it's not matching up, if you notice that someone is saying something about you or saying something about your friend, or your stories don't really align, it taints your testimony and it lets you kind of prepare a new testimony, a more false testimony. So we usually require by law that witnesses that are going to testify, they're not allowed in the court proceedings, they're not allowed in the courtroom whatsoever, to do our best to preserve their testimony and also to preserve their body language and demeanor when being questioned, because it is something that the jury is instructed on, that they are allowed to gauge the honesty of somebody by looking at their body language and how they react to certain questions. And so if you're hearing something that doesn't really align with what you're saying, the shock that's going to happen is probably when you're sitting in the stand, not when you're getting re-questioned. But George and Cindy were allowed to sit in on this trial. So George had been called back and forth to the stand a million times. And he was also called back to the stand after Simon had testified. And George denied everything Simon said. He said, no, I never told him that the car was at AMSCOT for 3 days. I never talked about the gas cans. Like he basically said that Simon was lying, that he had never said these things. Next to the stand was Cindy Anthony, and she is obviously the mother of Casey Anthony and the grandmother of Kaylee Anthony. So the first thing that the prosecution does with Cindy Anthony is they want to begin to discredit the defense's allegations and their opening statements that the Anthony family, George and Cindy, were enraged when they found out that Casey was pregnant. So she testifies that she actually didn't find out Casey was pregnant until like 5 or 6 weeks before she gave birth to Kaylee. And that when she found out that Casey was pregnant, she was actually really happy and really excited. And that they ended up throwing her a baby shower, and then they immediately converted their computer room into a nursery that was Winnie the Pooh themed. She also testified that she allowed Casey and Kaylee to stay there for as long as Casey wanted, and that they actually helped with their expenses for the daughter and for the granddaughter. Cindy testified that yes, although the outdoor pool where the defense is saying that Kaylee drowned, it is very accessible. Like there's no gate that's like blocking it. It's right like steps from the front door. Their backyard isn't massive. That it is very accessible, but that they do take precautions, that the back door that leads to the backyard where the pool is, that they habitually keep it locked. They also said that they've like baby-proofed the house, which was slightly irrelevant, but I think the prosecution was trying to use it to the fact that if this family went so out of their way to baby-proof toilets and baby-proof tubs and baby-proof cupboards, that they wouldn't just leave this back door unlocked. Cindy also testified that the pool was above ground pool, so it wasn't in the ground. And so in order to access the pool, you actually had to climb up a ladder because the pool was about 5 feet above the ground. And the ladder was actually removable, so you can take it on and off. And that typically, once Kaylee became a toddler and was able to really walk and get around, that typically they would remove the ladder and lay it along the floor. That way Kaylee wouldn't get in it. Now, she did testify, like on cross-examination, that there had been times where they had accidentally left the stairs up, and that she does recall a date relatively close to June 16th where somebody, not her, but either George or Lee, the brother of Casey, did leave the ladder up. But she says that she thinks, she's not positive, but she thinks the day in question, she did have the ladder down on the floor and that it wasn't propped up leading to the pool. She also testified that yes, Kaylee did love swimming, and that with every bean and every second that she possibly could, she would be in the pool swimming, or be asking to go into the pool, or trying to go outdoors to get to the pool, and things of that nature, that Kaylee really loved swimming. Cindy also testified that Casey had been telling her for years that she worked at Universal Studios, even going as far as showing her an ID badge, a lanyard, showing her emails that were printed out, showing her like name badges. And she also asked, she's like, hey, well, this is kind of weird. Why is this name badge that you're showing me in this picture, why is it somebody else's name? It's not your name. And Casey would tell her things like, oh, we just think it's funny at work to like switch name tags and stuff. She would and I said she would show her like printed out emails. So she wouldn't show the email on the phone, but she would like have printed out emails that she would show her mom. Cindy continued testifying that Casey had been telling her since the spring of 2006 that she had a nanny by the name of Zanny Fernandez Gonzalez, and that she had been Kaylee's nanny since 2006 for a couple of years now, and that how she met Zanny was through a co-worker that worked at Universal Studios that also had a son. Then Cindy's 911 calls were brought into evidence, and Cindy did call the police a couple of times on the same evening. But the one in specific that was brought into evidence was the one of Casey's car. So the 911 call specifically says this.
Mom, I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car.
Okay, what is the 3-year-old's name?
Kaylee.
Cindy tried to say that it was actually just merely an expression, that she didn't actually mean that she smelled a dead body in the car, that she was just saying that it smelled so terrible and so awful that she was just using that as an expression to voice her concerns that something could be wrong. But she says that it actually more so smelled like garbage than it did a dead body. And she said that when she went into the back of the car, she found a lot of trash, including pizza boxes, tobacco, like chewing tobacco, like spit, like when you spit into a cup of like chewing tobacco, and that there was a bunch of maggots and stuff inside of the trash bag as well. And she said that she believed that this was the source of the stench that she had been smelling. Cindy testified that when they picked up the car from the impound lot, Casey's purse was in the car that was like full of all of her belongings, and that there was also like Kaylee's backpack and favorite doll and car seat in there as well. And she was actually able to use Casey's purse in order to find where Casey was, because she testified that she had been talking to Casey every day for those 31 days, multiple times a day, morning and evening. And that she also had been asking Casey numerous times, can I talk to Kaylee? But Casey always had an excuse. The excuses were that she was working on this big project with these meetings with Universal Studios. The negotiations were going really long. So Kaylee had been spending the night at the nanny's house. And that when she was done with these negotiations, she would be able to go pick up Kaylee and bring her home to go see Cindy. She also then testified that at one point in time, Casey told her that Zanny actually fell really, really ill, and she lived up in Jacksonville, Florida. And so she had to go up to Jacksonville, and she brought Kaylee with her to be by Zanny's side because Zanny was extremely ill. And when Cindy was saying, isn't this her family's responsibility? She said that Zanny's mom, Gloria, was also very ill because she was elderly. So Zanny's brother and sister were actually taking care of the elderly mom and couldn't be at the hospital to help take care of Zanny. And that because Zanny is like family and Zanny loves Kaylee so much and has done so much for them, she feels like it's her obligation to be there for Zanny while she's in the hospital. So she could never really get a straight answer out of Casey. She could never talk to her granddaughter. She could never see her granddaughter. There was always some type of an excuse. This brought Cindy Anthony to create a Facebook account to find her daughter. So through Casey's Facebook postings, Cindy testified that she saw that she was lying. She wasn't in Jacksonville. She wasn't in Orlando. She wasn't in all of these different places. She was actually in town and going out and being with her friends. So she had no idea why Casey was lying and why she couldn't talk to her granddaughter. So at that point in time, she then testifies, that's when she went through Casey's purse that they found in the vehicle that was impounded. And she found this resume of this woman named Amy. And she didn't know why the resume was in there, but she called the phone number and she was like, can I please meet up with you? Like, I'm Casey's mom. I'm extremely concerned. I just want to know what's happening to my daughter and happening to my granddaughter. I haven't seen them in a month. So she testifies that at this point in time, this woman named Amy met up with her and she led Cindy Anthony to the home of Tony Lazzaro, which is where Casey was staying. She said that when she went to go pick up Casey, Casey was angry and she was reluctant to leave with her and didn't want to leave with her. But Cindy said, look, if you come with me, just come with me to come pick up Kaylee from the babysitters and I'll bring you right back here. You don't have to stay with me. I just want to pick up Kaylee. I haven't spoken to her. I haven't seen her. Come with me to come get her. So she testifies that Casey reluctantly left with her to go to the babysitter's house to pick up Kaylee. But once they got into the car, Cindy testifies that Casey Anthony actually wouldn't take her to go see Kaylee, and she wouldn't give her any information on where this nanny lived or how to get there. And she said that Kaylee had already been sleeping and she didn't want to wake Kaylee up. And if Casey could just, if Cindy could just give her one more day, then she would be able to get Kaylee. Cindy testified that she told her daughter, no, I've given you 31 days to produce Kaylee and you haven't done so. I'm not giving you another day. So they're sitting in the vehicle and Cindy says that is when she decided to call the police and report her daughter. So she called the police and then this phone call was introduced as well, where she said that she wanted to report somebody to get arrested, and it was her 22-year-old daughter, and she wanted her arrested for grand theft and child neglect. And she said that Casey actually stole the vehicle that was impounded, right? And the vehicle was actually registered to George and herself, and that it wasn't Casey's car and that Casey had stolen it. The police said, okay, that's fine. We'll come take a report, but we need you to go back to your home and we'll meet you at your house. So Cindy begins driving back home. And now I'm kind of mixing in a little bit of cross-examination as well as direct examination just to get out like the full testimony of what she said. She said that when she arrived, that Lee Anthony, who was their son, was waiting outside of the Anthony home, and that it was weird because Lee didn't live with them, and Lee hasn't lived with them for a really long time. And when she was asked on cross-examination, like, okay, well, why was it weird that Lee was there? Did you tell George or Lee about what was going on with Casey? And she said, no. I told George that I had found out where Casey was and I was going to get Casey and I was going to get Kaylee, but that was it. I never told them that I was calling the police. I never told them that I was reporting her for grand theft, nothing of that nature. And she testified that so when she got out of the car with Casey and Lee was there, she asked Lee, like, what are you doing here? And he said, well, Dad called me and Dad told me to come over to your house because something was going down and something was happening. So Cindy then testifies they all go inside and she tells Lee, your sister's not being very cooperative with me. She's not giving me the information that I need. All what I want to do is go pick up Kaylee from the babysitters. Can you please try to talk to your sister and find out like where the babysitter is located? So she then testifies that Lee goes into the room, into like the bathroom or into Casey's room to talk to Casey, and that she was listening in, like she kind of had her ear up to the door because he had shut the door, and that through their conversation, she heard Casey say that she doesn't know where Kaylee is and that Kaylee had actually been missing for 31 days and that she had been kidnapped by the nanny. And this is when that infamous phone call of the 911 recording took place. After she heard this, Cindy Anthony calls the police again, and that's when she says, I need help. I need you to come down here. I just picked up my daughter's car from the impound lot. It smells like there's been a dead body in this damn car. I need you guys to come down here. My daughter just told me that my granddaughter has been missing for 31 days and that she had been kidnapped. So she's testifying. She also testified on cross-examination that the reason why she said that there was a dead body in the car, not only as a figure of expression that it smelled really bad, but also because she had just found out that Kaylee had been missing for 31 days. So she felt like that statement in and of itself would be big enough to get the police down there as soon as possible and take this missing child report seriously. Now, in my mind, I think that's a little too muddy for the jury. It's one or the other. It was either just an expression, like it smells like a dead body's been in here. That's people say that, you know what I'm saying? So like that is a form of expression, but it can't both just be a lighthearted form of expression as well as a ploy to alert the police to get there quicker. So also on cross-examination, Jose Baez really focuses on the fact that George and Cindy Anthony wouldn't let Casey ever go to an OBGYN. That the first time she went to an OBGYN that they're aware of was when they found out that Casey was pregnant. That was the first time that they quote unquote allowed her to go to an OBGYN. And Jose Baez is like, that's really weird. She was 19 years old when she got pregnant. How are you not allowing your daughter to go to an OBGYN? And Cindy testifies that the reason why is because Cindy herself had been really traumatized by an OBGYN before, so she was trying to spare her daughter this trauma. And I think, and a lot of people think, is the reason why Jose Baez was asking this question about the OBGYN was because he was trying to insinuate that George didn't want her to go to the OBGYN because he wanted to conceal the sexual abuse that she had been going through at his hands. Then on cross-examination, George goes through a long list of people he called imaginary friends. And this list is like over 10 people. And he would ask Cindy very specific details about these people that Casey would tell her about Zanny, about Gloria, about Jeff Hopkins, about his son, about these people at Universal, about Lisa. It was a long list of people. And what was crazy about it is that it was very, very detailed. Like it was almost like a freaking autobiography, a biography, whatever it's called, of somebody's life. That's how detailed it was. And these were stories that had been going on for years, like 3-4+ years. And the reason why Jose Baez is basically calling out all of these lies that Casey had been telling is because he's trying to discredit the prosecution's theory and argument that Casey only began lying 31 days ago when her daughter went missing. So she's only lying for the benefit of herself. Jose is trying to point out that actually Casey has been lying her whole life. And the reason why he's trying to pull this out is because he, again, is saying that she has been taught her whole life to be a liar due to the sexual abuse. So Cindy Anthony, like her husband George, gets called to the stand a lot during these times. Not as much as George. George was called by the prosecution the most because he was the prosecution's like star witness, pretty much, just like he was for the grand jury indictment. But I'm just going to throw in one of Cindy's other testimonies into this piece of pie right now so we can kind of get the story together. During the investigation, there was an arrest warrant for the Anthony home computer. And on the Anthony home computer, there was searches for chloroform. And the defense, they actually called Cindy Anthony to the stand to discredit these findings, right, that the investigators talked about with the computer searches of the chloroform. So they called her to the stand, and Cindy Anthony said that, no, those were actually my searches. My dog had been getting really sick, And I think it's because my dog has been eating the bamboo sticks that were outside. So I was actually trying to look up chlorophyll, and when I was on the computer, one of the suggested searches after I typed in like CHL was chloroform. And she was like, so I decided to click on it as well and see what chloroform was, see how to make it, and see if it would be helpful at all so my dog could stop getting sick and I could like help my plants. The district attorney did cross-examination on this part because, and I know they were originally doing direct examination on her because she was the state's witness, but this is at a point in time where the defense called her during their case. So now it flips and the district attorney does cross-examination. So during their cross-examination, they point out that Cindy had time cards and timestamps from work, and that she was time-stamped in multiple times at her work location, which is nowhere near the home. And Cindy just stuck to her guns. Even to this day, Cindy still sticks to her guns, saying that, no, I made that search. I remember making that search. I don't really care that my time card was used or that I was punched in at work. I know that I made those searches. So I do want to point out that there was like some heavy hitting evidence that the district attorney and the defense did not bring in about these computer searches. On the day of June 16th, which is, we can all at least conclusively agree something happened on June 16th, right? Murder, accidental death, whatever people believe. There was computer searches on the home, and it was at 2:49, a computer was activated, right? And it was logged into Casey Anthony's password protected user on this computer, right? And we know that Casey was home because, as I said before, her cell phone records prove that George did lie. He said that Casey had left to go work, right? And that was the last time he saw Kaylee, when we know Casey never left the house that day. So her cell phone's pinging off at a tower near the house. The family computer was activated at 2:49. At 2:51, there was a Google search for foolproof suffocation. And then 5 seconds later, the user clicked on an article that criticizes pro-suicide websites that include advice on foolproof ways to die, about how to poison yourself and then follow it up by suffocation by placing a plastic bag over your head. And then at 2:52, the browser records activity on MySpace, which is a website that Casey Anthony frequently used. So nobody brought up these Google searches. The defense attorney did talk about them after the trial was over. About a year after the trial was over, he did bring up that he was surprised that the district attorney never brought up these computer searches. And then also we do know that at 3:02, George Anthony used his cell phone to call the home line, which was a little bit strange because he says that he was at work at 3 o'clock, which means he most likely would have used his work phone at his desk instead of his cell phone. But I digress. It's just something that I would have brought up as a defense attorney. But let me get back on track. I'm sorry. So the defense attorney said that he was very surprised the district attorney never brought this up because he thought this was pretty heavy hitting evidence for them. I think, and Jose Baez slightly alluded to this, I think the district attorney didn't bring it up because although there would have been helpful, such as the suffocation and the MySpace login, what would have been hurtful to them was the suicide, because George is the only person that attempted suicide and had a suicide note, where Casey was out there partying and living her best life and obviously never had suicide on her mind, according to them, right? That would go against their theory. The only person that tried to commit suicide was George. So I think in their mind, they're like, this will hurt us too much because the defense attorney is going to harp on that, which Jose Baez admitted a year later that he would have. That if the district attorney would have brought that in, he would have insinuated that it was George and he would have tied it to the suicide note. And he said, in fact, that's why he even asked George about the suicide note, because he was trying to prepare himself for these searches, but the DA never brought it forward. And with that, for now, the legal story of Casey Anthony has come to a close. I hope you all learned something today. And with that, the defense rests.